Hi everyone, it's Gemma, host of the show. Before we start this episode, I've got a little request for you. We're living in uncertain times. Powerful leaders are promoting disinformation that supports their preferred ideology. Inconvenient facts and the institutions that share them are being challenged and threatened. And freedoms vital to healthy democracies are under threat. Against this background, the conversation's role has never been more important. The world needs an independent platform where experts can share knowledge without fear or censorship. We're a charitable organisation with a small team dedicated to publishing high-quality work in partnership with researchers and academics around the world. We are not bankrolled by a shadowy oligarch or media baron, nor is the conversation owned by an opaque offshore corporation. Our funding comes from our university partners, foundations, and from listeners and readers like you. So please consider supporting us by going to donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. Giving us your backing will help us to carry on making vital expert analysis free to access for everyone. Thanks very much, and now on with this week's episode.
There are some people who I think they have an animal that they love. And they're like, I'm obsessed with tigers or I'm obsessed with gorillas and I'm going to save this animal. And it's kind of like that throughout their entire life. I'm not necessarily one of those people. I never set out to kind of save the sharks.
This is Holly Booth. She's a research associate in biology at the University of Oxford in the UK. But she lives for most of the time in Indonesia, where she's really now trying to save the sharks.
When I kind of started getting into the shark and ray conservation problem, I realised how complex and interesting it was, and still trying to solve it today.
Sharks get a bad rap. Film after film portrays them as terrifying predators, the bane of surfers and swimmers, the hunters. But in Indonesia, sharks are the hunted. It's the world's largest shark fishing nation. There are more species of sharks and their close relatives, including rays, found in Indonesian waters than any other country on the planet. But it's estimated that 1 in 3 species of sharks and their close relatives are threatened with extinction. So Indonesia was the perfect place for Holly Booth and her colleagues at a local NGO that she founded to test out a new idea: to pay fishermen to release any sharks they catch. It's the first time a trial like this has been done on a marine conservation project. Holly's just published the results, and they offer some hard lessons for conservationists around the world. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. What kinds of sharks and rays are most endangered?
The most at-risk families are those which are large, slow-growing and long-lived, economically valuable, and highly susceptible to capture in fisheries. And so this includes, for example, hammerhead sharks.
Those are the ones that have got the kind of, they look like a hammer at the front.
Exactly. And that actually makes them highly susceptible to capture in fisheries because their funny shaped heads mean that they get tangled in nets and lines really easily, unfortunately. Also things like oceanic white-tip shark. That's very like your typical grey, pointy-teeth, scary shark. They're slow-growing, long-lived, and their fin is quite valuable. And then there's also wedgefish and giant guitarfish. So they're technically rays, but they're often referred to as shark-like rays because they're kind of flat-bodied like a ray, but they have a large dorsal fin. And those dorsal fins are also quite valuable in the international fin trade.
And why are sharks important to the ecosystem? Why is it worth saving them?
Sharks are often apex or mesopredators, and this means that they play important roles in food webs. Because they also migrate large distances, they play important roles in kind of nutrient transfer in ocean ecosystems. And there's also some evidence that they can also play an important role in, for example, mitigating the impacts of climate change because of these important roles they play in maintaining functional and productive ocean ecosystems.
And the fact that they are being endangered is particularly an issue in Indonesia. How many sharks and rays are caught each year in Indonesia? And is the problem particularly bad there?
So numbers of sharks and rays that are caught is pretty difficult to estimate. In terms of official production statistics, around 90,000 to 100,000 tonnes per year We can do a kind of back of the envelope calculation. Obviously, sharks and rays are lots of different sizes, but if we say the average shark weighs 30 kilos, then we're talking roughly 3 million sharks per year caught in Indonesia. And this is in part just because Indonesia is a huge archipelagic country with an extensive coastline and a huge fishery. So there are many more nets and lines in the water in Indonesia than there are in many other countries in the world. Addressing the issue of shark overfishing in Indonesia is also really complex because most fisheries in Indonesia are small scale, so more than 90%, and support coastal livelihoods. And in these fisheries, people use pretty much everything that they catch, including sharks and rays, either as a direct source of animal protein or to sell for money to feed their families and send their kids to school. So we have these kind of complex social dynamics to contend with as well.
What kind of boats are we talking about? What kind of nets?
It can just be one guy in a boat using a small line, or in some cases using spears. More often than not, we're talking about gill nets. It's basically just like a huge, long net. You sort of like fix it to the ground, for example, and leave it to soak overnight and catch whatever fish swim into the net, basically, and then go and pick it up afterwards. Gill nets and long lines are basically the two highest risk gear types because they're kind of unselective. So long line is where you have many, many, many lines and hooks, and you can either have them floating on the surface of the water or have them kind of dragging along the bottom, and they just tend to hook whatever's hanging around down there. I often refer to them as small-scale mixed species fisheries because the fishes are basically going out in their coastal waters, catching whatever they can get, basically, yeah. And the sharks hang out where the fish hang out, and so, yeah, often the sharks get tangled in the nets and lines.
Mohammed Said Ramdan is a colleague of Holly's at the NGO she founded in Indonesia, where he's also doing a PhD in coastal and marine resource management at IPB University. Are sharks and rays traditionally eaten in Indonesia? Is it a typical dish? Have you eaten them?
For me, I never eat them. Basically because, like it's quite smelly. But most of the people like a coastal area, they eat some, the fish also eat it.
So they just eat it, they grill it, or they
smoke
make a stew,
and also like stew sometimes. But most of them, like what I found at the field, is just you make it like a sambal, like fried it like with spices and then eat it with rice.
Said isn't from a fishing community.
I can call it myself like an outsider, like, so this is really challenging part when doing the project.
Part of Said's job has been talking to fishermen about their attitudes towards sharks and rays. He told me it can be a sensitive issue.
When you talk about shark and ray, it's just like their plate, like their livelihood.
Do they know that these sharks and rays are endangered?
I can say that, like they don't really care about it. Because what is the more important for them is like they get the fish to sell. Because they have like a economical value on the market. They don't really care like this is really critical species for the ecosystem. Because the most important thing is that they bring income for their family. So for the daily basis, like how to survive each day.
In 2022, Holly decided to test whether paying fishermen in Indonesia to release sharks and rays back into the ocean could work to reduce those being brought to shore, either to be sold or eaten.
I think incentive-based approaches have got huge promise for delivering biodiversity outcomes whilst also maintaining or improving the well-being of coastal communities. We have these kind of tricky trade-offs between conservation outcomes and livelihoods because fishers use and eat and sell everything that they catch, including endangered sharks and rays. And if we ask them to reduce those catches, then there's going to be some kind of opportunity cost to them. And so if we're asking them to participate in conservation, what's in it for them, and why should we be expecting some of the world's poorest people to bear the majority of the cost of conservation? And so the idea was that we compensate fishers for safely releasing critically endangered species. That compensation is equal to the amount that they could have sold them for in the market. And so the fishers don't lose out, but also the shark doesn't die. And we get positive conservation outcomes, and the fishers are no worse off.
That's what you were aiming for.
That's what we were aiming for. That was my hypothesis, if you like, that we're going to deliver this kind of win-win solution. And nobody's ever done a randomized controlled trial of an incentive-based marine conservation program before. In fact, randomized controlled trials for behaviorally mediated conservation programs in general are like vanishingly rare. There's sort of only a handful of studies, and it is the best way to get good evidence on what is and isn't working, and to be able to kind of quantify outcomes from an intervention and also cost effectiveness. So I wanted to kind of really empirically, robustly measure it, initially with the hope that I would be able to provide really good evidence that our program delivered only positive outcomes for biodiversity and people.
Holly decided to test this pay-to-release scheme in a randomised control trial. First of all, she had to research how to design the incentive. This meant asking fishermen what would be a good price for two particular endangered species, hammerhead sharks and wedgefish, a type of ray. They did this in two different areas, one in Aceh Jaya and another in East Lombok. In total, 87 fishing vessels decided to take part. And because this was a randomised control trial, they split these vessels randomly into two groups.
So one of the groups at any one time is eligible to receive compensation for releases.
That's the treatment group.
While the other half acts as a control group and continues to fish as usual.
They actually switched the groups round during the study, though, so that both sets of fishermen had a chance to get paid for releasing sharks. The amount of compensation depended on the location and the size of the hammerhead sharks and wedgefish that the fishermen there usually caught. For example, it ranged from $5 for a wedgefish in Aceh Jaya, where fishermen usually caught juveniles, up to $150 in East Lombok, where fishermen typically caught large mature adults whose fins can go for hundreds of dollars on international markets.
We established voluntary agreements to compensate fishers if they safely released wedgefish and hammerheads, with the compensation conditional on submission of live release videos showing the released individuals happily and safely swimming far away from the vessel. And those videos had to be taken on specific cameras that were provided by the project.
Tada, bro. Goodbye. Yeah, goodbye.
This is sound from some of these videos.
Go.
Saeed was one of the people in the team monitoring the videos of the releases, determining whether or not fishermen should get compensation.
Action. Okay. Ayo, kabur.
How did you react when you saw these videos of sharks and rays being released?
Like the emotion when you see like the fish or shark and rays being released in the video, you can also feel like you are on the boat. Like you just take care of the shark and rays like your child, because you know that your shark and rays is really important.
Ya, selamat jalan. Jalan, selamat jalan.
You see as well sometimes the interaction between the fisher with the shark and rays. They sometimes saying like in bahasa called like bye bye, see you again, like something like that. So if you're just seeing the video, you're really engaged with it, like really happy with it.
Holly had a similar reaction to the videos.
I was so excited. Just the fact that it was actually working, you know. We're trying this new intervention, this pay-to-release scheme, and fishers were responding. We were getting videos of live releases coming in, and I was just like, oh my God, it's happening, it's working. And, you know, sharing the videos, and it was just like super exciting to see these kind of happy live wedgefish sort of swimming away from the boats. So that was fun. But obviously we had to collect enough data to be able to experimentally evaluate the intervention. So throughout the trial, we collected data on live releases. Then we also collected data on retained catches per vessel as well. So we used retained catches as a proxy for mortality, fishing mortality. And the hope was that the pay-to-release program would reduce fishing mortality of these critically endangered species. And we have a team of people on the ground who are there every day collecting data on retained catches as the different fishing vessels come in.
And those retained catches essentially will just go to the market to be sold?
In some cases, might just be eaten by the fishers that caught them or sold in domestic markets, yeah. So really, we had to wait a year minimum before we had any data to have enough power to say anything meaningful about the intervention.
Every week, Michelle Grattan offers you a ringside seat to the latest in Australian politics with interviews and insights from political insiders. On the Conversations Politics with Michelle Grattan podcast, we cut through the spin and get to the substance with independent analysis of the issues that really matter. Stay informed. Search and follow Politics with Michelle Grattan wherever you get your podcasts.
Holly Booth has just published her research paper detailing the results of the pay-to-release shark study in Indonesia. There was lots to celebrate. Over 16 months of the study, 475 wedgefish and 364 hammerhead sharks were safely released by fishermen. But when Holly dug down into the data, it was a more complex picture.
If we were to just look at the number of live releases in the treatment group only, we were getting huge amounts of releases of wedgefish, which is what we expected because wedgefish tend to survive better in nets than hammerheads. And we were getting some releases of hammerheads. So all super positive. But when we had a look at the experimental data and we compared the treatment group with the control group, there was about a 25% reduction in mortality for wedgefish between the treatment group and the control group. But actually, it seemed like there was an increase in mortality of hammerheads. So hammerhead mortality was 44% higher in the treatment group relative to the control group. And we were like, well, what is going on here? And essentially, what we realized was happening is that a small group of vessels, not all of them, appeared to be purposefully increasing their catches of these species in order to get more payments, so trying to game the system. There are clearly some fishers that do know if we do X, Y, Z, we can get more hammerheads and wedgefish.
What was your reaction when you saw that data?
So honestly, I was absolutely gutted at first because we'd had all these live releases and I was so excited and I felt like something positive was happening. And then when I realized that there was evidence that there was also some of these kind of unintended consequences, I was kind of gutted. And to some degree, I felt like a fraud because I guess I am both a researcher and a conservationist, and I'm trying to deliver positive conservation outcomes for the world. And I'd also kind of earlier that year won a couple of awards for my contributions to understanding the complexities of shark and ray conservation and community-based conservation and all that kind of thing. And now the data was showing that actually it wasn't all quite as positive and rosy as we'd originally hoped. And yeah, I was in a bit of a panic as well, because it's also, as well as being the researcher, I'm also kind of the founder and chair of this NGO, and we're trying to raise funds to do more cool stuff. And what I really want is just a positive story to tell the world. But obviously, I still want to go ahead and publish the results. And so I felt conflicted.
What do you do now that this has happened? How do you move forward from here?
Once the initial shock wore off, I was ultimately grateful that we had this experimental data because it meant that we could use the information to move forward and make some adaptations to the program. One of them was that we implemented size-based pricing. So when we very first started the program, we just had one price per study site. And one of the things we noticed from watching the live release videos is that many of the releases were small individuals. And so one of the things I was concerned about was that actually perhaps the compensation price was too high for small individuals, and that was what was driving fishers to go and catch more in order to release more. So we now have 3 price brackets, small, medium and large, for wedgefish. We also implemented a cap on the number of compensated releases per week that any single vessel is eligible to be compensated for. And so now fishers can only receive compensation for up to 2 released wedgefish per week and 5 to 15 released hammerheads, depending on the season, because hammerhead catches is seasonal. And the final thing that we've been doing that we've recently started is a gear swap program where we're actually trying to encourage fishers to use a different type of fishing gear other than gill nets with much lower bycatch rates. So trying to avoid catches of hammerhead sharks and wedgefish in the first place. And our hope is that through using this different gear, fishers can reduce their bycatch whilst also maintaining or improving their average income from fishing. And so far, we haven't redone the experimental analysis yet, but based on kind of eyeballing the data, we can see, first of all, that the gear swap scheme looks really promising. It's a relatively small number of fishers in that pilot at the moment. We're only looking at sort of 4 vessels that started towards the end of last year. But so far, 0 bycatch of hammerheads and wedgefish in this new gear, and income per trip seems to be stable. So that's fantastic.
More generally, and as a way to end, it would be good to just get your view on what this means for trying to study conservation interventions. Because it's hard, right? From what you've just found, it's hard to do and design these interventions. And in your paper, you write that even the most careful efforts to design a conservation program may not account for all types of real-world uncertainties and complexities. So what do you think other people who are trying to do something similar should learn from your experience?
So I think, first of all, the design phase is really important. Given that we have limited conservation funding, you ideally want an intervention that is designed to suit local contexts, that people are brought into, that is based on good behavioural science, and that you believe is actually going to change people's behaviour and deliver positive outcomes. There are so many conservation programs that are just based on flawed assumptions, or, you know, if we're just going to turn up and give people beehives and then they'll stop doing this other damaging behaviour. And that happens, like, I think very often is sort of flawed assumptions or not really understanding the target communities in the first place. Then I just think it underlines how important experimental evaluations are, despite the fact that they're so rare. So most conservation programs do not assess their impact empirically at all, let alone using an experimental approach. And I personally think that's absolutely shocking. There's just assumptions around, you know, if we're spending money on activities, or if we have a new marine protected area policy that gets signed, because we've got this piece of paper saying there's a new protected area, magically we're changing people's behaviour and delivering conservation outcomes. And it just isn't the case. And so I think, first of all, we just need more impact evaluation for conservation programs, and we need to do it as rigorously as possible. Now, randomized controlled trials are the kind of gold standard, and they're not feasible in every single type of conservation program, because sometimes you can't randomize, or the scale at which you're implementing your intervention, it just doesn't lend itself to randomized controlled trial. But they're not as hard as people might think. It is doable, and in my opinion, saying it's too hard just isn't good enough anymore. We have a biodiversity crisis that we need to address. We have limited funding, and, you know, I think it's time that conservation organisations are held more accountable for actually proving that they're delivering positive outcomes and being cost effective. And I think that donors need to be requesting better evaluations as well. And honestly, I think one of the challenges is that sometimes people don't want to know the answer. People would rather tell a nice story, and it would have been very easy for us to just continue to tell a nice story about all these live releases. Isn't it great? Look at all the fishers engaging in positive conservation actions, which is how most conservation programs are evaluated. You know, give us more money, please. But, you know, I strongly believe in evidence-based conservation, and if we don't have good data on what's happening, then ultimately we don't know whether we're delivering positive outcomes or not.
Well, thank you so much, Holly, for explaining what you did and what you found, and good luck with the next stage of it.
Yeah, brilliant. It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for your interest.
That's it for this week's episode. It was written and produced by me, Gemma Ware, with production assistance from Katie Flood and Mend Marawani. Sound design and mixing by Louise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, please do email us at podcast@theconversation.com. We'd love to hear from you. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the knowledge of academic experts to help you make better decisions. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the show wherever you listen to us. It really helps other people find us. Thanks very much for listening.